Ben McLemore's story was supposed to be one of the good ones. He grew up in serious poverty in the Wellston area of St. Louis, in a house that sometimes had no electricity, and basketball was the way out for his whole family. At Kansas, he was so good that people discussed him as a possible number 1 overall pick, a smooth shooting guard with a jumper scouts compared to Ray Allen's. Even LeBron James endorsed him on Twitter. The Sacramento Kings took him 7th in the 2013 draft, 3 spots before CJ McCollum, and 8 spots before future 2-time MVP and NBA champion Giannis Antetokounmpo, though literally anyone else in that draft class would have been a better first overall pick than the actual number 1 pick, Anthony Bennett, who is considered the biggest bust in NBA history, even more so than Kwame Brown. The plan was for McLemore's shooting to anchor the Kings' rebuild. One of the first things he did with his rookie contract was move his mother out of that Wellston house, and Sports Illustrated wrote the whole thing up as one of the feel-good stories out of that draft class, which is worth remembering as you hear the rest of this. His career never quite took off. He spent 4 seasons in Sacramento without breaking out, drifted to Memphis, and looked finished before the Houston Rockets revived him as a floor spacer next to James Harden, where he hit over 200 threes across 2 seasons, and finally looked like the player Kansas fans remembered. After a stop with the Lakers, where he actually got to play alongside LeBron James, he landed with the Portland Trail Blazers for the 2021-2022 season, and that timing is the whole story, because the crime he's in prison for right now happened days before that Trailblazer season got rolling. On October 3rd, 2021, McLemore attended a house party in Lake Oswego, an affluent suburb of Portland, along with several Blazers players and staff. A 21-year-old woman at the party drank to the point that she could not stay conscious, and witnesses described her as barely able to function before she was left on a couch to sleep it off. McLemore raped her on that couch while she drifted in and out of awareness. She reported it almost immediately, underwent a hospital examination the next day, and cooperated fully with detectives. And then, publicly, nothing happened for 2 years. That silence is what makes this case infuriating for a lot of people. McLemore played out the season in Portland, appeared in 64 games, and when the NBA moved on from him, he signed contracts in Europe and then China, earning professional money on the other side of the world, while a detective in Clackamas County kept building the file. A grand jury indicted him in 2023. He was arrested when he returned to America, and the case finally reached a courtroom in July 2025, nearly 4 years after that party. Nobody was accused of protecting him, but the optics were terrible. A rich athlete living his life abroad, while the woman he assaulted rebuilt hers in the same town where it happened. At trial, his defense argued that the encounter was consensual, and the woman testified about waking up during the assault, unable to move or speak. Friends who had been at the party backed up her account of how impaired she was, and the physical evidence collected the next morning did the rest. The jury believed her. They convicted McLemore of first-degree rape and felony second-degree sexual abuse, acquitting him on one remaining count, and under Oregon's Measure 11, a first-degree rape conviction carries a mandatory minimum with no time off for good behavior. The judge gave him 8 years and 4 months, and every single day of it must be served. He went straight into Oregon state custody, and he'll register as a sex offender for life and won't walk free until well into the 2030s. At sentencing, the victim told the court she had spent 4 years watching him get paid to play basketball while she waited for anyone to hold him accountable. McLemore has maintained through his lawyer that the encounter was consensual and that he intends to keep fighting, and Oregon's appeal courts move slowly, so don't expect that to change anytime soon. The league itself never had to act, because by the time the indictment landed, he was already out of the NBA, which means he never faced any discipline at all from the sport that made him rich. Jovan Belcher was thought of as a grinder, not a star, and that's what made teams love him. He came out of West Babylon, New York, played college ball at the University of Maine, which sends almost nobody to the NFL, and went undrafted in 2009. The Kansas City Chiefs gave him a camp invite. He made the roster on special teams through pure violence and effort, and within 2 years, he had fought his way into the starting lineup at inside linebacker. By 2012, he had appeared in every single game of his 4-year career, 59 straight, and he just earned a contract paying him about $2 million for the season. He lived in Kansas City with his girlfriend, Cassandra Perkins, who he'd been introduced to through the wife of teammate Jamal Charles, Cassandra's cousin. In September 2012, they had a daughter, Zoe. The relationship was falling apart by that fall, with arguments over money, jealousy, and the strain of a new baby, and people around the couple knew it. On the night of November 30th, Belcher was out drinking downtown, while Cassandra went to a Trey Songz concert with friends. Around 2:45 in the morning, police found Belcher asleep in his car outside another woman's apartment, and instead of arresting him, they let him go inside. Cassandra got home later that night, and when Belcher returned in the morning, the argument that had been simmering for months ignited one final time. Just before 8 a.m. on December 1st, in the bedroom of their home, Belcher shot Cassandra 9 times. His own mother, who moved in weeks earlier to help with the baby, was inside the house and heard every shot, and 3-month-old Zoe was down the hall. Cassandra was 22 years old. Belcher leaned over her, apologized, kissed her and his daughter, and then drove 5 miles to the Kansas City Chiefs practice facility at Arrowhead. In the parking lot, he found General Manager Scott Pioli, thanked him, and asked to see head coach Romeo Crennel. When Crennel came out with the linebackers coach, Belcher thanked him too for everything they'd done for him, told them he'd killed Cassandra, and as police cars pulled into the lot, he stepped back behind a vehicle and shot himself in the head. Crennel later described trying to talk him out of it in those final seconds, and both coaches said Belcher never threatened them. He wanted to say thank you before he did it. The Kansas City Chiefs played their scheduled home game against Carolina the very next afternoon and won it, a decision that players later admitted felt surreal and that people still argue about. And the stadium held a moment of silence for victims of domestic violence, notably not for Belcher himself. But the story didn't end at the funeral. In 2013, Belcher's family had his body exhumed for one specific purpose, and in 2014, the results came back. The examination of his brain found damage consistent with CTE, the degenerative disease caused by repeated head impacts in a man who was 25 years old. Those findings are normally associated with players decades older, and combined with blood alcohol level around twice the legal limit at his death, it painted a picture of a brain that was failing him. None of that is offered here as an excuse, and Cassandra's relatives have been absolutely clear they don't accept it as one, because whatever was happening in his skull, she's the one who never got to raise her daughter. Zoe was orphaned before she was old enough to hold her own head up, and she was raised by Cassandra's family, with a wrongful death claim pursued against the team on her behalf. She inherited nearly everything from her father's estate, which means she'll one day fully understand that her security came from the man who took her mother. Inside the league, the case forced uncomfortable conversations about what teams actually know about the men in their locker rooms, because multiple people around Belcher later described warning signs in those final months, namely the drinking, painkillers, short-term memory problems he complained about, and nobody connected them until it was over. His mother filed suits against the Kansas City Chiefs over the head trauma and the care he received, arguing the team had years of chances to intervene, and Cassandra's relatives spent those same years pushing back on a framing that made him the victim of the story, because in reality, the victim was Cassandra. In 2018 and 2019, Felipe Vasquez was one of the best relief pitchers on the planet. He came out of Venezuela through the Tampa Bay Rays and Washington Nationals, and arrived in Pittsburgh in 2016. He made the All-Star team in 2018, made it again in 2019, and signed an extension that looked like one of the most team-friendly contracts in baseball. If you polled Pittsburgh Pirate fans in the summer of 2019 on their favorite player, he might have won. Then, on September 17, 2019, Pennsylvania state troopers and Florida investigators arrested him at his home, and the fan favorite era ended in a single morning. The Pittsburgh Pirates were already having one of the ugliest seasons in franchise memory, with clubhouse fights and coaching staff on the way out, and the arrest of their closer with 2 weeks left buried all of it. Teammates found out the way fans did, from the news, and the team stripped his name and image out of the ballpark within days. The investigation had started in Florida, where detectives discovered that Vasquez had been exchanging explicit messages and videos with a girl he knew was 13 years old, a young fan who had first made contact with him online, and it got worse from there, because this was never only a phone crime. Prosecutors in Pennsylvania established that in 2017, Vasquez drove to the Scranton area, met the girl in person, and had contact with her in his vehicle. As already stated, she was 13. He was a 26-year-old major league closer in the middle of the season, and afterward, he kept in contact with her by phone, and the messages investigators pulled removed any doubt about whether he knew exactly how old she was. He sat in the Westmoreland County Jail for a year and a half awaiting trial, unable to make bail conditions work with his immigration status, and when the trial finally happened in May 2021, he made the remarkable decision to testify in his own defense. His story was that he believed the girl was older, and prosecutors dismantled it with his own words, message after message shown to the jury. It took them about 4 hours to convict him on all 15 counts, including statutory assault and child pornography offences, with the related Florida charges over the video evidence stacked on top of his record. And then came his sentence: 2 to 4 years, 15 felony convictions involving a 13-year-old girl, committed by a wealthy adult celebrity, and the total sentence was shorter than the contract extension he'd signed. The judge worked within Pennsylvania's guidelines and gave him credit for the time he'd already sat in county jail, which meant that by 2023, the state of Pennsylvania was finished with Felipe Vasquez entirely. In Pittsburgh, fans who had worn his jersey to the ballpark 2 years earlier were left processing the fact that the sentence for what he did to a child came in shorter than some suspensions that the league hands out for gambling. The only reason he didn't simply walk out the front door is his passport. Because he's a Venezuelan citizen with felony convictions against a child, the state handed him directly to ICE the moment his sentence ended, and at the end of 2023, he was deported to Venezuela with no legal path back. Major League Baseball had already placed him on the restricted list, freezing him out of the sport, and the Pittsburgh Pirates moved on like he never existed. His victims sued him in federal court in Florida and won a civil judgment of more than $11 million in 2023, money she is still trying to actually collect from a man living in another continent. He has since dropped the Vasquez surname and gone back to his birth name, Rivero, and as of this year, he is playing professionally again in Venezuela, where American courts and American baseball can't touch him. He'll carry sex offender status for life, and plenty of people will tell you that this is a fraction of what he really deserves. Mel Hall broke into Major League Baseball with the Chicago Cubs in 1981 and finished third in Rookie of the Year voting in 1983, and in the middle of the 1984 season, Chicago packaged him with a young Joe Carter to get Rick Sutcliffe from Cleveland. Sutcliffe went on to win the C.Y. Young and dragged the Chicago Cubs to the playoffs, so the trade is famous. And Hall spent the next 5 seasons as a productive outfielder for some bad Cleveland Indians teams before New York came calling. From 1989 through 1992, he was an everyday player for the New York Yankees, a left-handed batter with some pop and a flashy glove. And he had a habit of showing up to the park in fur coats with pet cougars named Trouble and Double. But talk to people from those New York Yankees teams, and the numbers aren't what they remember. Hall was a bully, and his favorite target was a shy, sensitive rookie named Bernie Williams. Hall rode him constantly and loudly called him Zero, as in zero impact on the team, and the abuse got bad enough that the veterans stepped in to shield the young player, who would go on to become a New York Yankees legend. That cruelty is worth mentioning because of what came later, and because it showed you that the charm he showed to the public was selective. The New York Yankees released him after 1992. He spent a few more seasons in Japan, and when the baseball money dried up, he settled near Fort Worth, Texas, and started coaching youth sports. That's where he found his victim. He coached a girls' AAU basketball team, and in 1998, he fixated on a 12-year-old player. He worked on her family first, the way these men almost always do. He made himself a constant presence, offered rides to and from practice, promised one-on-one training, and convinced her parents that a former big leaguer taking a special interest in their daughter was the opportunity of a lifetime. Once that trust existed, he raped her, and it continued for months in the private situations he engineered, in his car after practice, and during the alone time the family kept granting him. He kept her quiet the way offenders like him usually manage it, by making a child believe that nobody on earth would take her word over a former New York Yankees. She was right to be afraid, because for years, nobody knew. She carried it silently into adulthood, and only came forward when she was in her 20s, walking into a police station in Louisville, Texas, to report what had been done to her years earlier. Hall was arrested in June 2007, and once investigators started digging, they learned she wasn't the only one, because the investigation itself identified a second victim who had been under 14. And at trial, another woman testified that Hall had abused her as a teenager during the same era. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had specifically built his post-baseball life around access to young girls, and Hall's defense answered by claiming the accusers were making it up for attention. It didn't stop there, because once the guilty verdict came in, the sentencing phase turned into something rarer, with additional women coming forward to testify about him, including one who said the abuse in her case reached back to 1989. The jury heard all of it before deciding his number. The Fort Worth jury didn't take long in 2009, guilty on 3 counts, including aggravated assault of a child, and the sentence was 45 years in Texas State Prison. Under Texas law, he has to serve at least half of it before he can even sit in front of a parole board, which puts his first hearing around 2031, when he'll be pushing 70 years old. And parole boards in Texas are not famous for their mercy toward child rapists, who still insist they did nothing. His appeals went nowhere. As of this video, he's in a Texas prison in his mid-60s, and he has never once admitted what he did. Former teammates who tolerated him for years have publicly said the sentence fits the man they knew, and the woman he abused as a girl has spoken about how long it took to be believed. He operated in plain sight for years, in gyms full of parents, and his fame was his camouflage. Kellen Winslow Jr. was born into football royalty. His father is a Hall of Fame tight end, arguably the greatest ever at that position, and for a while his son looked like a worthy heir. At Miami, he became infamous for the "I'm a soldier" rants after a loss, but also became the best tight end in college football, and the Cleveland Browns traded up to take him 6th overall in 2004. His pro career was at war with his own body. He broke his leg 2 games into his rookie year, then destroyed his knee in a motorcycle accident that voided parts of his contract and cost him the 2005 season. And he battled staph infections in Cleveland that he later went public about. And he still made it back, catching 89 balls in 2006, making the Pro Bowl in 2007, and piling up more than 5,000 career receiving yards with Cleveland and Tampa Bay, before short stops elsewhere wound his career down in 2013. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers thought enough of him to trade for him and hand him a contract that briefly made him the highest paid tight end in football. All in all, the game paid him over $40 million, and he had every advantage a man can have, and no reason on earth to become what he became. By 2018, he was retired, married with kids, and living in a wealthy stretch of North San Diego County, and that's when women in the area started reporting a man in an SUV. What came out in court was that Winslow was driving around in his own community, selecting victims, specifically because no one would believe them. Women who were homeless, older, or alone. In March 2018, he picked up a 54-year-old hitchhiker and raped her. 2 months later, he approached a 58-year-old homeless woman in a shopping center, offered her a ride and a coffee, drove her somewhere isolated, and raped her in his SUV. She went to the police the same day and identified him, and her testimony is a big part of why he's in prison. A woman he counted on being invisible, turning out to be the most credible witness against him. In between, a 57-year-old neighbor reported him exposing himself to her while she gardened, and prosecutors also accused him of entering the homes of women in their 70s and 80s at a nearby RV park, charges the jury would later deadlock on. And this is where his case goes from disturbing to almost unbelievable. Winslow was arrested in June 2018 and bailed out for $2 million, with strict orders to behave while awaiting trial. Instead, in early 2019, with jury selection for his own rape trial underway that same period, he went to a gym in Carlsbad, slid into the jacuzzi beside a 77-year-old woman, and committed a lewd act in front of her. A man on trial for multiple rapes, with private investigators and cameras and the entire country watching, could not stop himself for a few months. The judge revoked his bail, and he never breathed free air again. The 2019 trial ended with convictions for the rape of the homeless woman, along with the exposure and lewd conduct counts, and a hung jury on the remaining charges. Facing a retrial that could have meant life in prison, Winslow took a plea deal and pleaded guilty to 2 more crimes: the sexual battery of the hitchhiker and the rape of an unconscious 17-year-old girl at a party back in 2003, when he was a 19-year-old college star. So his crimes didn't start in retirement. It started when he was still being called the future of that position. In March 2021, a judge sentenced him to 14 years, the maximum available under the plea agreement, and Winslow appeared by video and apologized, with his lawyers arguing that 2 decades of football had damaged his brain and turned him into someone his family didn't recognize. You can weigh that argument however you like, and the judge clearly didn't, because at sentencing, he said Winslow could only be described with 2 words: sexual predator, and noted that he had chosen his victims for their vulnerability on purpose. His own father reportedly struggled to reconcile any of it and has stayed almost entirely silent in public. Winslow has kept filing petitions to cut his sentence, citing childhood trauma and a brain injury, and a California appeals court shut down the latest attempt in early 2025. He's in a California state prison today, in protective custody for stretches, because former NFL players are targets inside, and his release date lands later this decade. Darren Sharper was one of the best football players of his generation. Green Bay took him in the 2nd round in 1997. He played in a Super Bowl as a rookie, and over 14 seasons with the Packers and then the Vikings, he built a reputation as a ball hawk with a knack for taking interceptions back for touchdowns. Then came 2009 in New Orleans, one of the great single seasons a safety has ever had. 9 interceptions, a record-setting pile of return yards, and a Super Bowl 44 ring in February. He finished his career with 63 interceptions, still among the most in NFL history, 5 Pro Bowls, and a spot on the All-Decade team of the 2000s. There was a legitimate Hall of Fame conversation for him. When he retired, NFL Network hired him as an analyst, and he publicly presented himself as a role model, even lending his name to campaigns about protecting women. That part about protecting women matters, because from at least 2013 and into January 2014, while he was that trusted face on television, Sharper was running the same play in city after city. He would meet women at a bar or a club, often approaching them in pairs so everything felt safer, invite them somewhere for one more drink, and hand them glasses he had already dosed with sedatives, sometimes mixed with other drugs. The women would black out within minutes, and he raped them while they were unconscious. Many woke up hours later in a hotel room or his apartment, with no memory of the night, and some of them only pieced it together after going to police on instinct and getting tested, with the sedatives still in their blood. Sharper did this in Los Angeles, New Orleans, Las Vegas, and in the Phoenix area, and in Louisiana he didn't even work alone, because 2 other associates were convicted alongside him. One of them was a working sheriff's deputy named Brandon Licardi, who got 17 years, and another man, Eric Nunez, who got 10, both for distributing drugs with intent to commit rape. In one Los Angeles case, a victim briefly woke up during the assault, and evidence showed he simply dosed women heavily enough that it wouldn't happen again. When the LAPD arrested him in early 2014, it was because 2 women he dosed together in Los Angeles woke up, compared what little they remembered, and went straight to the police. And once his name hit the news, detectives across multiple states realized they were sitting on an identical MO. The famous ex-player who would offer women free drinks that would cause blackouts, and federal prosecutors eventually tied him to as many as 16 victims. The NFL Network took him off the air the day the first charges landed. Several victims later described the specific damage of being drugged, that they'd been told what happened to them by nurses and detectives, and that not remembering made it worse rather than better. Facing prosecutions in 4 states at once, Sharper's lawyers negotiated a global plea deal to resolve everything together, and the original terms called for roughly 9 years. A federal judge in New Orleans read the file, looked at what 9 years meant against 16 drugged and raped women, and refused to accept it, calling the deal too lenient for the conduct. After a psychiatric evaluation, the judge sentenced him in 2016 to 18 years and 4 months in federal prison, with his state sentences from Louisiana, California, and elsewhere running alongside it, plus lifetime registration as a sex offender. He's been in federal custody ever since. He tried to undo it all from the inside, filing to withdraw his plea deal, and later, in 2025, arguing his sentence should be cut because of traumatic brain injury from football, and the courts denied every attempt. In May of this year, he was transferred out of federal prison and into a halfway house, the standard last step of a federal sentence, with his release projected for late 2028. He'll be 53 years old when he walks out, and beyond lifetime registration as a sex offender, nothing will restrict where he goes or who he meets. Some of his victims have spoken publicly about his release approaching, and the consistent thread is that 18 years never came close to matching what he took from them. In 2009, Bruno Fernandes was one of the most popular athletes in Brazil. He'd grown up rough in Ribeirão das Neves, a poor city outside Belo Horizonte, raised mostly by his grandmother, and he clawed his way through youth football to become the goalkeeper and captain of Flamengo, the most supported club in the country. In 2009, he backstopped them to the Brazilian League title, their first in 17 years, lifting the trophy in front of tens of millions of supporters. He was 24, and there was serious talk about the national team and the 2014 World Cup on home soil, and European clubs were reportedly sniffing around. Away from the pitch, Bruno had been having an affair with Eliza Somodio, a model he'd met at a party, and in 2009, she became pregnant and said the baby was his. Bruno wanted nothing to do with it. He denied paternity and refused to pay, and in October 2009, Eliza went to the police and reported that Bruno and his friends had held her against her will and forced abortion drugs on her. Under the law at the time, the complaint stalled, and Brazilian media largely treated her as a gold digger going after a champion. Her son was born in February 2010. She kept pushing the paternity claim, and in June 2010, she travelled to Rio to pursue it. That is the last month anyone saw Eliza Samudio alive. What happened next came out through testimony, including from a teenage cousin of Bruno's who was there. Eliza and her 4-month-old baby were picked up in Rio and driven to Bruno's ranch outside Belo Horizonte, where she was held for days. According to the testimony that convicted him, Bruno ordered her killing, and an ex-police officer in his circle, a man nicknamed Bola, strangled her. Her body was then dismembered, and the court heard that her remains were fed to dogs, which is why she has never been found and why her mother has never had a grave to visit. The baby was done with strangers and eventually made it to Eliza's mother, who has raised him ever since. When the story broke weeks later, it consumed Brazil completely. Bruno turned himself in with a warrant out for his arrest in July 2010. The club terminated his contract, and coverage returned to Eliza's 2009 police complaint, which had named Bruno directly and had never been acted on. By the 2013 trial, he had shifted to admitting he knew what happened to Eliza, while denying he gave the order, and the jury didn't buy the distinction. Guilty of ordering the murder, along with the kidnapping and concealing of the body, and the sentence was 22 years and 3 months, with Bola and other accomplices convicted around him, including Bruno's own wife, Diane, found guilty of the kidnapping of the baby, while the teenage cousin whose account cracked the case open was handled in the juvenile system for his role. In 2017, after less than 7 years inside, Brazil's Supreme Court released him on a technicality over how long his appeal had sat pending, and within weeks, a professional club called Boa Esporte signed him to be their goalkeeper. Sponsors abandoned the club in days, women's groups protested nationally, and a few months later, the court reversed itself and sent him back to prison, but Brazilian sentencing rules kept doing him favours. By 2019, he had progressed to a semi-open regime, allowed out for work, and the work he declared was professional football. So he suited up for a small club in Minas Gerais, while technically still serving time for having the mother of his child murdered. He kept signing with lower division clubs ever since, and as of this year, Bruno has actually appeared in the Copa do Brasil, the national cup competition, while Eliza's mother protests outside every club that puts a shirt on his back. The boy he refused to acknowledge is a teenager now, raised by his grandmother, and DNA eventually confirmed what Eliza said all along. Bruno was the father. A man convicted of ordering the murder of the mother of his child is a working professional goalkeeper in 2026, and no rule in Brazilian football prevents it. Born in Los Angeles to a Mexican family, Sergio Mitre came up with the Cubs in 2003 and was traded to Florida in the deal that sent Juan Pierre to Chicago, and his best season came with the Marlins in 2007, where Joe Girardi was his manager. When Girardi took over the Yankees, he brought Mitre to New York, and Mitre spent parts of the 3 seasons in the Bronx, including the 2009 championship year. His last big league appearances came in 2011, bouncing between the Yankees and the Brewers. After the majors, Mitre moved to the Mexican League, where he pitched for a better part of a decade and remained a recognizable name, finishing up around Monclova in Coahuila, where he was part of a championship season in 2019. By 2020, he was in his late 30s, living in Saltillo, the state capital, dating a local woman who had a daughter from a previous relationship, a little girl named Inez, who was 22 months old. On July 24, 2020, Inez was left in Mitre's care, and within hours, she was carried into a hospital already beyond saving. The autopsy ended any possible debate about what happened when she was alone with him. Inez had been beaten and sexually assaulted, and she died of the internal injuries he inflicted. She was not yet 2 years old, and there was no other adults to point to. Mitre ran. Mexican authorities tracked him down and arrested him about a week later, and prosecutors charged him under aggravated femicide, the law covering the killing of women and girls that carries some of the heaviest penalties that exist in Mexican criminal law. Mitre was held in pre-trial detention the entire time the case moved through the pandemic-era courts, and in early 2022, he was convicted and sentenced to 50 years, plus financial reparations directed to the child's family. The court also ordered him to issue a public apology and to fund a memorial for the girl. Mexico has no early release mechanism that meaningfully dents a number like that, so barring a successful appeal, Mitre stays inside prison until he is pushing 90 years old. It's one of the longest prison terms ever handed to a former Major League player, even longer than Mel Hall's, and more than double what Bruno got for a murder. Inez's mother testified through the process and has continued to speak publicly about her daughter by name. The baseball world has almost nothing to say about him. When former teammates and Yankees personnel get asked about Sergio Mitre, the answer is usually silence or refusal to discuss him at all. He was cut loose by everyone connected to him within days of the arrest, and the alumni events that celebrate every fringe player from the 2009 Yankees roster leave him out entirely. He went from a World Series celebration in the Bronx to a Coahuila prison cell, and he is the only person on this list whose crime record decided was worth half a century. And that's the end of the video, folks. If you found this one interesting, then please be sure to give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you're new, and consider donating on Patreon. All patrons get early ad-free access to videos and higher tiers get their name on the screen and a shout out. I'd like to give a shout out to all of my patrons for their continued support, especially those whose names you're seeing on screen now, particularly Father Figure, Alana Polden, JJD04, Rosalie Evelyn, Raina, Toka355, The Amazing Crazy and Scary World of Squishy 200815, The Vampire, Soak Pigeon, Bradley Stewart, Squall and Fury, Stahlstorm, John Aaron Snow, Psychic Perk, Bohag, Peanut Mama 0724, Vampiric Misfit, Hendrik Fan 5, Sunny Hauser, Bailey Cosmic Black Metal 96, Mimi, Light Into Sunlight, KJ Musical, Losanna, Brandon Field, Helen Korn, Kyle, BAN, Brendan O'Connell, Adam Clayton, Cal Nagula, Edward Howard, Danny Jade, Paul Mendoza, Alex Christmas, Bella Schwartz, Belsie Gell, Stimulate, Inquisitor Zarius, and Dick the Cock Johnson and the Woodmaster at WrestleMania X69 or maybe not dude. Thank you very much for watching and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.